The SCP Foundation has spent decades containing things that should not exist, but a handful of those things don't just threaten people, they threaten everything, and the gap between regional outbreak and existence deleted is shorter than you'd think. Today we're going through every world-ending SCP, ranked from the ones that could wipe out a continent to the ones that could erase reality itself. Starting with something that feels disturbingly close to home, SCP-610. Most horror starts with something dying. SCP-610 is worse than that, because nothing dies. It's a pink vascular fungal organism first documented on rural farmland in Russia, which is exactly the kind of mundane origin story that makes it so unsettling. It converts organic tissue into pulsing biomass through direct contact and airborne spores. Animals, plants, humans. It doesn't discriminate. Everything becomes part of the growth, but here's the part nobody wants to sit with. The victims aren't killed, they're assimilated. The infection has already consumed a vast stretch of land near Lake Baikal across multiple confirmed sites, with containment perimeters that make we have it under control sound genuinely delusional. The organism also adapts, which means understanding it and stopping it are two entirely different problems. If SCP-610 is the slow creep you can almost outrun, SCP-682 is the thing that hunts you down while you're trying. SCP-498, an alarm clock that won't let you sleep, sounds annoying, and for about the first few hours after exposure, it probably is. Just a little restless, a little wired, nothing you'd flag as a medical emergency. The problem is that SCP-498 doesn't just keep you awake, it keeps you awake permanently. Total, absolute, non-negotiable alertness. No drowsiness, no mental fog, no gradual slide toward unconsciousness. Your brain simply refuses to shut down. Remarkable, really? Right up until the point where it isn't. Here's the thing about sleep deprivation, it kills you. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with a kind of grinding inevitability that makes it one of the more unpleasant ways to go. SCP-498 accelerates that process by removing every natural pressure valve your body has for forcing rest. Subjects remain cognitively functional for longer than they should, which means they're fully aware of exactly what's happening to them the entire time, which is, not ideal. The containment requirements are almost insultingly simple for something this dangerous. Keep it in a standard lockbox, don't let anyone hear it go off. The simplicity of that solution somehow makes the whole thing worse. If SCP-498 is a slow, quiet horror, SCP-169 is the opposite problem entirely. SCP-169. Here's a thing that should genuinely bother you. There is a crustacean sitting at the bottom of the southern Atlantic Ocean right now that is longer than Western Europe. Over 2,000 kilometers of shell and claw just sitting in the dark. It has been there for over 100 million years. Every civilization, every war, every extinction event we know about happened while this thing was napping. The Foundation can't contain it. That's not a resource problem, that's just physics. You cannot build a wall around something larger than a continent. So their entire strategy is essentially hoping it stays still. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. It has moved. Not charging, not attacking, just drifting. With a confirmed 3-kilometer shift detected in the modern era. That's it. A slow, almost imperceptible crawl, and the Foundation considers that alarming enough to warrant continuous monitoring. Every extinction level model they run assumes SCP-169 does not change course. The moment it decides to go somewhere, those models become irrelevant. Nobody knows if it's truly alive. Nobody knows if it's dead. No signals, no communication, no acknowledgement that anything above it exists. It might be sleeping. It might just be taking its time. It doesn't need to do anything dramatic. It just needs to wake up. If you think a passive threat is unsettling, wait until we get to SCP-2845, which is very much not passive and which requires a monthly human sacrifice just to stay in place. SCP-2845. Most threats in this video are contained in a box, a room, or an ocean trench. SCP-2845 is technically contained, just not in any way that should make you feel better about it. The entity is extraterrestrial, fully sapient, and looks like a deer, which sounds almost comforting until you understand what keeping it cooperative actually costs. Every 378 days, the Foundation performs a ritual, and ritual is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. The process involves Class D and H class personnel being subjected to acts including castration and cannibalism, carried out as scheduled maintenance, not desperation, not a last resort, operational protocol. They have institutionalized something that would make a medieval cult uncomfortable and written it into the paperwork, which is somehow worse when you see it formatted neatly in a document. Here's where it gets complicated. The Foundation doesn't actually fully understand what SCP-2845 is or what it wants. They know the ritual works. They know what happens when it doesn't, so they keep doing it on a schedule indefinitely because the alternative is presumably worse than whatever they're already doing. The entity uses transmutation effects on those who get too close or breach protocol. And the containment procedures exist precisely because letting that scale up is not something anyone wants to find out about firsthand. Speaking of threats operating on a scale that makes geography irrelevant, SCP-2399 has been sitting inside Jupiter's atmosphere since 1963, slowly breaking down, still transmitting, and nobody is sure what it's waiting for. SCP-2399. Everything up to this point has had a face, a form, something you can point at and say, that's the threat. SCP-2399 doesn't give you that. What it gives you is a broken machine, sitting inside Jupiter's lower atmosphere, roughly 5 astronomical units from the Sun, receiving transmissions from the Triangulum Galaxy, and running antimatter weapons systems that appear to be directly responsible for the Great Red Spot, that storm you've been staring at in science textbooks your whole life. That was this thing. It's been out there since at least 1963, when it was first visually confirmed. Here's the thing. It's visibly damaged, structurally degraded. By all reasonable assessment, it should have gone quiet decades ago, but it hasn't. It keeps running, and the leading theory is deeply uncomfortable. It's actively repairing itself. The Foundation has translated fragments, enough to identify repair commands and directives being processed, but not enough to understand the full picture of what it's preparing to do once those repairs are complete. That's the part that gets under your skin. Not the antimatter output, not the fact that it has been receiving what appear to be orders from another galaxy entirely. It's that the Foundation can read just enough to know something is happening, and not nearly enough to know why. It could be a weapon cycling back to operational status. It could be waiting for a signal. The partial translations suggest it has somewhere to be after Jupiter. The working theory is that somewhere is here. If that slow burn dread isn't enough for you, SCP-3007 operates on a completely different frequency. Less machine, more presence, and considerably less patient. SCP-3007. Here's the thing about SCP-3007. The Foundation has been watching it happen to people across the entire world for years, and they still cannot agree on whether it's a warning, a memory, or something actively trying to communicate. SCP-3007 is a hallucinogenic phenomenon, not contained to a building, not locked in a cell, not a creature you can neutralize. It hits people globally, and when it does, they see the same things: ruined cities, corpses, a black pillar standing in the middle of all of it like it belongs there. Every affected individual, regardless of location, regardless of language, regardless of whether they've ever spoken to another victim, reports the same vision. That level of consistency across an uncontained, worldwide phenomenon is exactly the kind of thing that keeps Foundation researchers staring at spreadsheets at 3 in the morning. And here's where it gets genuinely uncomfortable. Nobody knows what it's trying to show them. The ruins could be a warning about something coming. They could be a memory of something that already happened. The black pillar sitting at the center of the whole vision has never been explained, never been identified, never been decoded. It just stands there while the world burns around it. The Foundation cannot determine whether SCP-3007 is a message, a malfunction in collective human perception, or something else entirely. All 3 interpretations fit the available evidence. None of them rule the others out, and it keeps happening. No resolution, no sender, just the pillar. But SCP-3007 at least stays in the mind. SCP-5000 is something worse. A reason the Foundation exists at all, and a secret so dangerous they buried it inside their own history. SCP-5000. Here's the thing about every threat we've covered so far. They're all in some way things you could point at. A creature, a virus, a machine, a door, something outside you that wants to end the world. SCP-5000 is different, because according to the Foundation's own records, there is a version of history where they already did. SCP-5000 is a mechanical suit, officially designated the Absolute Exclusion Harness, and on its own that sounds almost boring. A damaged piece of equipment, safe class containment, not exactly the stuff of existential horror, except the files recovered from inside it tell a very specific story about an alternate timeline, one where the Foundation systematically turned against the entire human species and started killing everyone. But here's where it gets genuinely unsettling. The reason they did it wasn't madness. It wasn't a containment failure or a rogue director. It was a discovery, specifically the discovery of something living inside human psychospace, something so deeply embedded in the structure of human consciousness that the Foundation decided humanity itself had to go. Every person, all of them, as a solution, and the suit is the evidence. Someone from that timeline sent it here, loaded with documentation, which means somewhere in the multiverse there is a version of the Foundation that looked at the entirety of human existence and filed it under necessary loss. The current Foundation contains the suit, studies the files, sits with the knowledge that another version of itself made that call and apparently felt pretty good about it, which is, you know, not ideal if that kind of conceptual horror is unsettling. SCP-3125 is about to make it significantly worse. SCP-3125. Most anomalies punish you for getting too close. SCP-3125 punishes you for trying to understand it. That distinction sounds subtle. It is not. SCP-3125 is a high-dimensional meme complex, existing across dimensions that baseline human cognition isn't built to process. Clearance level so high that most Foundation researchers never even learn its designation exists, and exposure doesn't just cause damage, it erases. Researchers who comprehend it too directly don't end up hurt or hospitalized. They cease to exist along with any evidence that they ever did, which is, you know, not ideal. But here's where it gets genuinely dark. The primary vector of exposure isn't proximity. It isn't physical contact, it's comprehension. The more directly a researcher attempts to understand SCP-3125, the more dangerous it becomes. The research itself is the weapon. Think about what that actually means for the Foundation's methodology. The entire organization runs on documentation, analysis, and containment procedures built from accumulated understanding. SCP-3125 takes that entire framework and turns it into a self-destruct button. Every containment study is a self-defeating act. Every attempt to make it safer makes it worse. You can't even problem-solve your way out, because problem-solving is the problem. The Foundation classifies it among its top existential threats. Not because it's powerful in a conventional sense, because it is specifically, almost surgically hostile to the one thing the Foundation relies on to survive: knowing things. An entity that destroys you for understanding it is terrifying. An entity that also destroys the proof you ever tried is something else entirely. SCP-2317 operates on a completely different scale, and somehow it's worse. SCP-2317. Here's the thing about SCP-2317. The apocalypse it represents isn't an act of violence, it's an act of arithmetic. The entity is a colossal humanoid figure bound by 7 chains somewhere beyond a dimensional rift that the Foundation has been quietly maintaining for decades. The chains are degrading. That's not a theory or a worst-case projection. That's the documented status of every single one of them. Not might fail, will fail. The countdown is already running, but here's where it gets genuinely strange. The Foundation's own internal risk assessments have calculated a mean projected time to containment failure, and it isn't centuries away. It's closer, much closer. The kind of timeline where people who are alive right now are potentially alive for the end of it. The official response to this information, at least in terms of any real successor protocol, is basically nothing. The Class Z amnestics distributed to most personnel who access the file aren't for their protection. They're because the Foundation decided that most people simply don't need to know. The actual containment procedure in the event of full seal failure is classified at a level most Foundation personnel will never reach. What little leaks through the documentation suggests the contingency isn't containment at all. It's something else entirely, and whatever it is, nobody who reads it walks away feeling better about it. There's no cavalry, no backup plan in a sealed vault somewhere. The Foundation is maintaining a ritual it doesn't fully understand against a deadline it has already calculated, and the official response is to make sure the majority of people never find out how tight that deadline actually is. Which brings us to why it's bound in the first place. Because the question of what this thing actually is connects to something much larger and much older, and the answer to that is where this whole mythology gets genuinely dark. SCP-001, the Scarlet King. Here's the thing about SCP-2317. It wasn't the origin of the problem, it was a symptom. The Scarlet King is what 2317 connects back to. It's the entity that 2317 is directly linked to, which means that entire countdown to multiversal annihilation you just heard about doesn't exist in isolation. It exists because something larger is behind it, and the Foundation knows this because they've documented it, and that documentation is itself classified as anomalous. The act of writing it down breaks something. What makes the Scarlet King genuinely different from everything else on this list is that it isn't a creature. It's entropy given form and intent. Not a monster that wants to destroy things, but a principle that destruction organizes itself around. You can't negotiate with a principle, you can't outrun one, and you absolutely cannot contain one, because containment requires a framework, and the Scarlet King exists outside the framework where containment is even a coherent concept. It doesn't need to escape. Escape implies it was ever inside. Its influence doesn't stop at a single anomaly either. Its method of expansion isn't invasion. It seeds reality with offspring and waits for inheritance to do the work. The Foundation has documented multiple entities connected to it across its canon, and the implication every time is the same. These aren't accidents or random anomalies. They're deliberate. The Foundation's documentation of the Scarlet King is, by their own classification, itself anomalous. They can't fully describe it without the description becoming something it shouldn't be, which means everything you just read has to be taken with exactly that caveat. Some things don't have a file. They have an approximation of 1, but if you think an entity that exists beyond containment logic is a hard ceiling, SCP-3812 is going to break that ceiling and the building it's attached to. SCP-3812. Here's the thing about SCP-3812. The Foundation's standard playbook for every world-ending entity is documentation. Observe it, measure it, classify it, contain it. That process has worked more or less for thousands of anomalies. SCP-3812 is the one where that process is the problem. 3812 is a humanoid entity that knows it's fictional, not in a vague philosophical sense. It is structurally aware of narrative, of observation, of the fact that something is watching it and writing things down about it. And every time the Foundation files a report, every time a researcher adds a data point, 3812 gets measurably stronger. The documentation itself is an amplification mechanism, which is, not ideal. But here's where it gets genuinely strange. 3812 hasn't just been growing more powerful, it's retroactively rewritten its own SCP documentation multiple times, without a physical breach, without anyone noticing until they looked back at records that no longer matched what they remembered. The entry you read today is not the entry that was filed originally, and there's no way to know what the original said because 3812 already fixed that, so the Foundation did something they have never done with any other entity. They stopped looking, deliberately. The current containment strategy for SCP-3812 is to keep the documentation vague, incomplete, and actively misleading. The only way to slow it down is collective institutional ignorance. The answer to an unkillable, reality-rewriting entity aware of its own observation is to pretend as a global organization that you don't really know what it is, which makes independent verification of anything about 3812 structurally impossible, including this. If you think an entity that grows stronger every time someone talks about it is bad, wait until you hear about the one that already won, and the sun is how it tells you. SCP-001 When Day Breaks. Every entry on this list ends the world in some way. A flood, a plague, a door opening that shouldn't. Something comes, something destroys, and then it's over. When Day Breaks doesn't do that. When Day Breaks doesn't end anything. At 6 a.m. UTC on an undisclosed date, the sun changed. Nobody knows how, nobody knows why, and at a certain point, those questions stopped mattering. What matters is this: any exposure to unfiltered sunlight now triggers an irreversible biological transformation. Every organic thing it touches, human, animal, plant, converts into a conscious gelatinous biomass. Not dead, not unconscious. Aware, fragmented, and permanent. The sunrise line moves at roughly 1,600 kilometers per hour. The entire surface biosphere is gone within approximately 24 hours. Here's where it gets complicated. The victims don't die. That's the part nobody wants to sit with. Every person who walked outside, every animal that was grazing in a field, every organism the sunlight touched, they're still there, still aware. Distributed across a gelatinous layer, coating an entire planet, conscious in the way a shattered mirror is still a mirror, broken into fragments, but all of it still reflecting something. The Earth's biosphere has become one enormous, suffering entity with no mechanism of death and no possibility of reversal. The Foundation's final documentation for this event reads like exactly what it is: a last entry written by someone who already knew there was nothing left to contain. No protocols, no recovery options, no Foundation anymore. Just a record, because someone decided the ending deserved a witness. And somewhere right now in that world, the sun is still rising over a new hemisphere, still converting, still adding to it. The thing that used to be every living thing on Earth, aware and unending, feeling the warmth. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.